Hi there, Adam Gower here. Thanks so much for joining me today in the latest episode of the real estate crowdfunding show, Syndication in the Digital Age at GowerCrowd.com. So without doubt, the real estate crowdfunding site Fundrise has probably one of the most polished digital marketing strategies currently active online. Their branding and messaging is consistent across their website, advertising, and entire social media presence. And heading up this effort is my guest today, Jon Carden, Fundrise's head of marketing. Jon's background includes senior positions at Uber, and here's what you're going to learn about today, my conversation with him. The one key thing to do to reach prospective investors, how to refine your messaging, how to balance putting personality out there online without compromising your professionalism, and of course much more. And you'll hear Jon say that the basics of digital marketing are indeed rudimentary, right? They're basics, but doing them well is difficult, right? So to help you along, I've put together some advanced training that you can access at the show notes page that guide you through the basics and how you can implement them using best practices. You can find the show notes by navigating to the podcast page at GowerCrowd.com, where you'll also find some highlights from my conversation with Jon, as well as links to more information about him and Fundrise. Oh, and I've also included a link in there to my conversation in an earlier podcast series with Ben Miller, founder of Fundrise. That's GowerCrowd.com, where you can navigate to the podcast page. All right, that's it. So now it is my great pleasure to bring you Jon Carden, head of marketing at Fundrise. Jon, tell me a little about who you are, where you came from, and how you landed at Fundrise.
Sure, absolutely. My background is a little circuitous, I think, getting from where I started to where I am now. I've done everything from PR and communications for large trade associations in DC to major gift fundraising, where my job was to work with, ultra wealthy individuals and work with them to get donations for an organization, to Uber, which is where I was most recently. And that's where I sort of cut my teeth on the digital marketing piece, especially. And I spent about 3 years there at Uber. I was actually located in the DC office, which is the East Coast headquarters for Uber. Not a lot of people know that. They would assume New York. And so when I left Uber, I was leading all digital efforts for the Southeast US, everywhere from Washington, DC down to Miami. And so that included everything from our communications via email to social, did a lot with our partnerships teams, did a lot with our analytics teams. Okay. And then I had heard of Fundrise and actually was a really big fan of theirs, but I hadn't known that they were located in DC. And they reached out to me sort of randomly via LinkedIn one day. And I was shocked to find out that their office was like 3 blocks from mine. And that kicked off about a 6-month conversation with the co-founders here. And really, I was just a huge fan of the product and wanted the opportunity to help build an already extremely fast-growing business.
So let me ask you something, actually. So when you first heard of Fundrise, or when they first contacted you, what knowledge did you have of the ability to invest in real estate online?
Very little, honestly. I mean, I'm a big sort of personal finance fan myself, meaning I've read a lot and I've read all of the sort of normal books you probably would have read, and out there in the digital space where those things are being talked about. But I didn't know, I'd never heard of any competitor to Fundrises, for instance.
All right. So actually my follow-up question to that is, so how did you explain to me how you learned what Fundrise was in the context of our conversation today? So what would the funnels, right?
Absolutely. And I think, this really sort of helps even inform our funnels, which we'll talk more about in a second. Is what I did is I think what a lot of people do. So I immediately just sort of went on the search and the hunt for everything I could find online. Mm-hmm. And I had a couple of friends who I knew who had invested with Fundrise that I reached out to and said, hey, what is this thing? And then I just read everything I could, from sort of classic journalism pieces, whether it was CNBC or Yahoo Finance or wherever, to Reddit and forums, to reviews by sites like Investor Junkie and Financial Samurai, that sort of thing. And so I just read as much as I could, and then went to fundrise.com. All of that pretty much before ever going to fundrise.com, which I think is a maybe a big sort of secret tip for everyone out there, but it's what people are saying about you that often matters a lot more than what you're saying about yourself.
Right. That is interesting, isn't it? So the primary source of information for you was not necessarily the Fundrise site. It was everything in the ecosystem that is online that they've put out or that people have written about them.
Exactly. Yeah. I think going to fundrise.com and then seeing how they describe themselves at that point, I was personally more or less assessing their ability to tell their own story and less looking for actual substantive information, because I figure if other people aren't already talking about you and don't already know your story, then there's probably something wrong. And so, yeah, I spend most of my time sort of like, I think, buying a car now, where most of the time is spent not at the dealership, it's spent outside the dealership, and you only go there to buy,
So Jon, do you think that's how people actually do research these days? Is that how people understand opportunities, do you think?
Absolutely. I think any sort of industry, whether it's retail or buying a car, like I just mentioned, or buying a house, the vast majority of the consumer's time is spent off property. They're doing their own research. That's why influencers have been such a major force in retail, especially these days. Is people know what they want to buy before they ever get to the store. We live in this research economy now where information is everywhere. And so I think it's a really critical thing for people to understand, because if it's just on your property, it doesn't have the same weight as someone saying something about you.
Right. So, all right. So let's talk about the structure of how that kind of communication is built.
Sure.
For somebody that maybe doesn't have that infrastructure in place first. So where would you start the process, do you think?
I think a self-assessment's pretty critical. So, even if you've done no proactive work to this point, really try to put yourselves empathetically in the shoes of your potential customer or partner, whoever it is, and say, what could they find out about me now? Like, what is the narrative now, if anything? And then if there's nothing about you right now, you would want to say, well, where might they go thinking they would find something about me? So what are the sources of truth that are really popular for my audience in particular? And for different industries, that may be different things. But for us, a lot of times that's these like massive personal finance blogs. It's social media, of course. It's forums. Reddit is an incredibly powerful community now. And starting to find and really create a checklist. And then I think prioritizing like which ones can you actually influence or begin to build a presence on is huge. And again, that's going to depend on who your target is, but you just have to know where are your customers, where's your target audience living and breathing day to day. And you got to reach them there. So I think picking one place, whether it's social media for some brands, whether it's, really small niche groups. If you're going after like a very specific niche and you want to find like that one forum that people tend to congregate around, finding those things and then developing some sort of strategy for reaching that audience.
Okay, so let's talk about that strategy, right? So now let's say we identify, just for argument's sake, we identify a couple of low-hanging fruit, right? LinkedIn and Twitter, whatever it happens to be. It's maybe where we think we can find high net worth individuals who might be interested in investing with us. So we identify that, or maybe Reddit or somewhere else. Yeah. So now what's the next step? So we've ID'd the real estate, the digital real estate. Now what?
Yeah, I mean, there's two sort of broad, I think, trains of thought that you can take here. One is what we'll call like organic, where you're attempting to maybe create content that creates a lot of value for the audience that you're attempting to reach. And so you're hoping that maybe that content can be aggregated by one of these sites where you found people are living right now. So maybe on LinkedIn, there's like a very specific group on LinkedIn, and you're creating content that adds value for that group and trying to build sort of an organic reputation that way. If it's, the other sort of main train of thought is the paid route, where you're looking to actually partner with the groups themselves. A lot of these people who are attempting to build an audience, a big part of that is they know that at some point they'll be able to monetize having created this centralized location for people to meet and talk about whatever their shared interest is. And they know that brands will be very interested in being able to reach a high concentration of a single type of person. And so if you can find one of these centralized groups or sites or platforms and partner with them to put your information in front of their audience, that's another way to sort of test it out.
Okay, so that's interesting. So let's spin back briefly again to this creation of content. And some of you said very important, and that was adds value. So describe what you mean by that. What is content on social media from a real estate sponsor or developer's perspective that adds value?
Yeah, I think it depends on sort of what stage of consideration you think your audience is at. So if somebody's never heard of Fundrise, what does it look like for us to add value for them? It may be to just describe what, online investing in private real estate could look like. And so creating content that describes very, very clearly and very high level why this is an asset class that might be attractive in the first place. If, let's say, you've heard of us, but you're considering us versus even investing in another asset class altogether or in a competitor, it's about what is the secret sauce that makes Fundrise especially interesting. We find that over and over again, identifying the gap.
What do you got?
Sorry. Did I lose?
Yeah, you suddenly froze. Gosh, I thought I
no.
done.
No.
So identifying, right. So you were saying identify. I bet I recorded it as well. It's going to be one of those things. I'll go back. Blast, he had it all.
No, I know. Sorry.
So you were saying, right. So actually you were talking about identifying different levels, right, of somebody who's coming in at a certain point. So actually, let's jump, because I'm not sure where we cut off.
Sure. No, that's all right.
So how do you differentiate? I mean, how do you actually make that differentiation? Or how do you deliver content to people? How do you determine what stage they're at and then develop and deliver appropriate content to them?
It depends on the channel and how targeted we're able to be. So with email, for instance, we can be extremely targeted. We know exactly who we're sending an email to. So we can get very, very, very niche and say, we're going to deliver this amount of information. It's the perfect amount of information for the right audience. However, something like LinkedIn or Facebook, where you have a broad audience, you're best off, I think, being sort of disciplined and picking where you think sort of the highest impact, lowest hanging fruit lies. So for us, for instance, we don't spend a lot of time educating people on why real estate investing matters. That's something, of course, that's important. But we figure that if you're not really interested enough in personal finance to understand how investing works, and then even one step below that, why real estate could be interesting, we probably, while we would love for those people to get education, it's just not the best use of our time right now. So instead, we focus an audience who already knows that real estate is attractive, but they just don't understand how it works online or why Fundrise might be the best avenue for that sort of thing. And so we just try to be disciplined and prioritize a very specific audience and always write or create content specifically for that person.
And how do you know what it is exactly to write about? Do you do focus groups, or is it tell me how you do that?
Yeah, I think we move quickly and iterate. That's sort of a lesson learned from Uber, maybe, where we are extremely data driven. So we know exactly how everything we do works and have a really good understanding, like very good leading indicators early on of whether or not we've guessed right. But my team, I sort of try to instill in them permission to fail. And as long as we're not doing something that could in any way degrade the brand, if someone has a good idea for something that they think could add value for our audience, we say, hey, move as fast as you can, execute at a high level, and then measure it really, consistently. If it works, double down. If it doesn't work, cut it and move on.
And when you say measure it, you're actually able to see what people are consuming of what you put out there, aren't you?
Absolutely. Yeah, we measure. I mean, we are as data-driven as any company that I've worked at. And, we've built a team that enables us to really understand the sort of first, second, third degree effects of everything we do, especially that happens in the digital marketplace.
That's fascinating. So how do you do that actually? How do you what are the data flows that you can utilize?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some of it's tools. So we work with companies like Mixpanel and of course Google Analytics and some of these. And we also have a lot of in-house solutions for actually aggregating the data, and use things like Tableau to sort of allow us to visualize the data. But the biggest key, as anyone who works in data would tell you, is not so much about getting the data, it's about actually acting on it. And so what we've done is we've just been able to work really hard to build an attribution system that allows us to know, for the vast majority of traffic that's coming to our website, the vast majority of signups and lead captures and investors, we know exactly what their journey has been to this point. And a lot of that's due to in-house solutions that our engineering team have built for us. And then we also have just really strong analysts in-house who are actually, helping us make decisions based on what we're seeing in terms of just broad trends. Because it's not really always about, there's a big debate in the digital world of like first click attribution or last click attribution, meaning is it the first site you ever went to that told you about Fundrise that's the most important part of your journey, or is it the last site that you went to before deciding to invest that's the most important part? And we try to sort of take this holistic perspective to help us, decide how to spend our money and spend our time.
Very interesting. So so you've alluded to something. You talked about the journey, and the journey implies a series of contact points,
right?
Both outside of the Fundrise ecosystem as well as inside. And this was something we chatted about before we started. So tell me more about this concept in the context of what is a funnel.
Yeah, absolutely. So the funnel, broadly speaking, is, the top of the funnel is people who've never, ever heard of Fundrise. So that's the broadest possible group. And, of course, my job is to make that amount smaller and smaller over time. But right now, there's still a ton of people who've never heard of us. And then you have people who've heard of us, but don't really know what we're doing. And then you have people who now are starting to consider us. And then, of course, we take you all the way down until you're an investor and hopefully you're an advocate for us. And you're really an ambassador for Fundrise out there. Of course, now knowing what that funnel is, the question is, where do we connect with you? And maybe even more importantly, where are you getting your information at each stage in the funnel? And so, for instance, you may have heard of us because you read an article on a personal finance website that talked about how to invest. You got a huge tax refund, and here's one way to invest that money. That's one place where a lot of people are finding information about where to invest next, even high net worth individuals. And so obviously we'd love to have a presence there. We use display advertising also with really, really smart targeting to be efficient to reach people who've probably never heard of us. And then our hope is now you've heard of us, now you want to Google us. And so then it's about the effort of when somebody Googles your brand, what do they find? And that's something that you should invest a lot of time in, is making sure that they find something that's going to be more persuasive than not. And then you come to our site for the first time. Maybe this is 6 months later, and we see this all the time. And now it's like, what are you finding based on the level of information you have? What are you finding on fundrise.com or on whatever landing page you came to? And then you give us your email address. And now it's, what information are we giving you now? Like, we kind of know what you know at this point. So what are maybe the gaps between you not investing and you investing that we can help close for you? And so we try to be very intentional. And of course we test everything all the time. But we try to be very intentional about making that funnel feel as natural as possible so that you just feel really confident in the buying decision or the investing decision you're about to make.
Yeah. And one thing that I've noticed is prominent in Fundrise's ecosystem is that absolutely everything I see from social media to advertising, it always looks exactly like Fundrise. So tell me a little about consistency and how you manage that process.
Yeah.
When you have all these different nuances on the different social media sites.
Totally. That's a huge part of my job. Like, we have an amazing team who are all running at full speed and sort of not different directions, but parallel directions. And a big part of my job is to try to make sure that all sort of stays headed towards the same goal, and that we're telling the same story, even if we're modulating our tone or telling a different aspect. Consistency just could not be more important, especially today, because getting attention is I think attention is one of the most valuable commodities that's out there right now. And every brand thinks that people are thinking about them more than they actually are. And so we feel like we are actually going to need to get in front of you 10, 11, 12 times before you'll even really consider investing. And for a lot of people, if you're inconsistent with your branding and your message, they won't even realize that they've come across your stuff 10, 11, 12 times. And so if you want to break through the noise today, I think consistency is as important as it's ever been. And if you were going to value one thing, I would say make sure people know when they've come across you and what you sound like and what you look like, because you're just not going to get that many chances to get someone's attention.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's unbelievably critical. Cannot emphasize that enough.
Yeah, it's really important, isn't it? There's actually two forms of consistency. One is in the way that you look, and also messaging. So
Yes.
how do you hone your message? Because you also have this, gosh, I say this with the greatest respect.
I can't wait. I'm very
It's a really simple message that you deliver, right? There's no complexity. It is, when you unravel it, anybody can understand it, from the least knowledgeable of real estate investing to the most sophisticated. So how do you drill down on doing that? It's not an easy thing to do.
No, it's not. And it's something that we're always trying to get better at. When I was first hired, we did an exercise internally where I asked people, everyone individually, even on our senior leadership team, what is Fundrise? And I actually got a lot of different answers because our model had changed many times over the years. And so that was something we had to start with internal and getting everyone on the same page with what exactly do we do? And that sounds so simplistic, but I think really every brand should probably do that every once in a while, like come up with kind of that positioning statement of like, who are we? Who are we for? How do we want to be perceived by our audience? But then whenever it comes to like actually sharing that message, there's sort of this age-old debate in marketing of features versus benefits. And I think we try to really emphasize now benefits, because benefits are easy to understand. It's like a benefit is, a feature is something like, we use all this technology to create this diversification within your portfolio. A benefit is not having to be afraid of a market downturn. It's like, it's feeling confident in your portfolio because you have asset class diversification that you couldn't have had before. And so for us, it's continually like challenging ourselves and trimming the fat and really drilling down on what are the benefits that we're offering to our investors, not so much like all the cool ways that we're creating those benefits, because that's just not really that impactful.
Right.
And I think that's where a lot of brands, especially in our space, get lost, is they know they're doing really cool things that have maybe even never been done before, but it doesn't actually matter to the investor. The investor just wants an amazing, portfolio. And so that's what we try to just constantly harp on internally and get better at every day.
So you've also mentioned the idea of feeling safe during a downturn. That's very interesting because that's topical.
Yeah.
And actually that leads into this question.
Sure.
The only place that I have actually heard that discussed in the Fundrise ecosystem is actually a really well-written, interesting article that Ben wrote. Right?
Yeah,
About exactly that.
About the downturn, yeah.
About a downturn, and I think he said, I wake up every night thinking about it, or there's not a day goes by that I don't.
That's true, yeah.
And it was a very interesting article. So here's my question about that.
Sure.
One of the things that I've understood or come to understand about social media is that it is, quote, social.
Yeah.
It is about personalities. It's about the soul of the company, the people of the company, etc. But when I see Fundrise in the online, I really do see a corporation a lot more than I see personalities. So can you talk about this kind of bifurcation of personality and how you manage that balance with the corporate feel?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really interesting challenge. I think brands more and more are trying to personalize who they are to their investor. We are a little skeptical of the efficacy of that at times. So it's not that you shouldn't stand for anything. It's not that you shouldn't have any personality. But again, I think that brands tend to assume that people are very, very interested in who you are and, you know, what your dog looks like. We're very proud of our dog, Zappa.
You do. You got a mascot, don't
Yeah,
you?
we got a mascot and he's great. But we're a little skeptical that that actually is the most important thing. And maybe at some point it does become very, very important. You know, like Uber obviously had some massive personality issues, and that was really derived from the founder at the time. And so it certainly can become an issue. For us, we feel like we're asking you to trust us, and we're asking you to entrust us with, you know, either thousands of dollars or millions of dollars, but either way, it's a substantial amount for you. And so we want to make sure that first and foremost, we're explaining exactly why we should be trusted. And that comes down to the product itself. And the people behind the product are, of course, extremely committed to doing a great job on behalf of our investors. We're extremely customer obsessed. But we don't feel like right now, the most important thing is to make sure that they know what Ben looks like even. And Ben doesn't really have the ego to make that his top priority. And frankly, you know, our investors are not begging for it either. We don't see that like, oh, if only we knew what Jon looked like. That just doesn't seem to be a huge priority for our investors. So at this point, we tend to use social media in a way that we think adds the most value actually for the investors rather than sort of for ourselves. And that tends to be a little bit more informational, maybe sometimes aspirational. But we don't take a really personal approach because we're a brand, and we're not going to pretend to not be a brand. We are a brand. So yeah, I mean, for now, and that's a little bit countercultural, maybe even for like I think the social sort of like guru mentality of the day, but it's been very effective for us.
Yes, it's very interesting that you say that. It is the zeitgeist, right? Is to have the personality up front and center, but you do it extraordinarily well without that. So it's an interesting case study, if you don't mind me using that.
Yeah, no, it's different. Yeah, it's different. Yeah. We recognize that.
So Jon,
go ahead.
So what are your biggest challenges at the moment then? And how do you deal with those as far as, you know, evolving the company?
Absolutely. I mean, interestingly, two of the things that you've already described as positives, I would say, are two things that we really want to get better at, which is consistency in message and how we look. That's something that we think, you know, we don't want to look good for a fintech brand. We want to look and sound good in relation to the other major digital brands in your life. So if you're one of our investors, you probably use Airbnb, you probably use Uber, and we don't want to look other from them. Not that we're going to be similar to them, obviously, in terms of the product, but we feel like be at that level in terms of everything we do. So that's a major challenge for me personally. And then I think also we really want to continue to build sort of long-term trust with our audience. That has such a massive knock-on benefit. You know, confidence is everything for our investor base. And so one, that can only be done through time. And so there's some like kind of hurry up and wait there, which can be a little frustrating, but it's important to just continue to deliver on your promise year after year. And then also make sure that we're never over promising anything. You know, we always want to sort of under promise, over deliver. And that's why Ben's letter, like you mentioned, a lot of companies wouldn't send a letter like that saying like, hey, listen, a downturn could happen. And here's exactly what we would do. And even though we've had this incredible track record really since day one, there's no guarantee that every year is going to outperform the stock market, you know? And so that like building trust is just such a massive thing, and you do it every day in everything you do, and you can lose it like that. And so I stay awake every night thinking about that. That's my version of the downturn, is just thinking about how to maintain and build trust over time.
Fascinating, Jon. What a pleasure talking to you. I was very much looking forward to it, and it's a real delight. Let me wrap up, if you don't mind, with three what I call sign-off questions that I ask of all my guests, and eventually we'll spin these off into a series of videos, actually, and those on social media. So my three sign-off questions are: what's the most important thing somebody starting out syndicating real estate online should keep in mind?
I think identify who your audience is going to be as early as possible, and try to go as narrow as possible. You can always expand your audience, but who your target customer is just matters so much. And therefore, it also comes down to like, how are you different from all the other options out there? Why are you the perfect option for this small audience? But you really have to go small to begin with and then expand from there.
Second question, what has been the hardest lesson you have learned online?
I think knowing when to go with your gut versus the data. We are extremely data driven, and we look for 100% confidence in our attribution in everything we do. And then there are times where in order to expand, you have to do something that you don't have any evidence for. And knowing how to judge sort of those big bets in a vacuum where you don't have the data, that's the real downside to being so data driven, is it can make you overly cautious. And so finding that balance, it's always, a game of balance, but that's a massive one.
So can you describe a risk you've taken that has paid off, that you weren't sure what was going to happen?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think an interesting one for us, for instance, is podcast advertising, where it's digital in a sense, but it's not, direct response. It's really difficult to attribute, interest from podcasts. And that was one where, we took a risk, and so far we feel like we found a strategy that works really well for us there.
I know a great podcast you can advertise on.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'll be on the phone separately here after this.
All right, last question. What are your key daily habits to be successful online?
Yeah, I think the two big things for me is one, I am a voracious consumer of all things internet, whether it's new platforms or it's major trends in terms of content. And then moving past that a little bit to the second thing is I try to stop and assess what this could possibly mean for brands. So an interesting example might be, I'm not convinced that voice, meaning like Alexa and Siri, actually has any real implications yet for brands like ours. And so I'm very, I would say, bearish on voice, because I just haven't seen any brand actually get a lot of use out of it. It's very hard to discover skills, et cetera. And yet you see things like chatbots, for instance, and how artificial intelligence is being used there to make buying experiences and support experiences more seamless. And I'm really, really bullish on that, because you can just see how it's actually making people's lives better. It's making the consumer's life easier online. And so would love to figure out how to make that work for us. But that just comes from consuming absolutely as much as I can find.
Jon, thanks so very much. What a pleasure talking to you. I really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Absolutely. Happy to help, and best of luck.
Thank you. That was Jon Carden, Head of Marketing at Fundrise. This balance between the brand of personality versus brand of company is an interesting one to me. You have to establish relationships with customers, right? Through putting forward at least the personality of your company, right? But also your personality as an individual. What Fundrise has truly mastered is the traditional format of putting brand before personality, and it's obviously working extremely well for them. So certainly something you can consider as you start to raise capital online or to advance your own current digital syndication activities. If you want to expand your investor network or raise even more money from your existing network, I've put together an advanced training for you where you can learn best practices, and you can find that at GowerCrowd.com on the podcast page. Hey, thanks for listening, and thank you, Jon Carden, Head of Marketing at Fundrise, for being such a great guest and for sharing your fascinating insights with us today. That's it. I'll see you next time. And in the meantime, this is Dr. Adam Gower signing off.